Thank you guys for joining us again today. Welcome to our panel discussing an imperative issue in our society, human trafficking. We are honored to be joined by a distinguished panel of experts, each bringing unique insights and experiences to the table. With us today, we have Elizabeth Solis, a grad student that is researching trafficking policy, specifically comprehensive policy, and Eli Johns, a University of Michigan graduate who works for the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants as an attorney for the STARS program. So to start us off, we have two general questions for you guys. What is human trafficking and why is it prevalent on a global scale?
So first of all, hi, I'm Elizabeth Solis. I'm actually an undergrad student, currently publishing some research right now, just for clarification. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. I think most commonly known human trafficking is defined as modern slavery. It's involuntary. It is a situation where abusers are involved and characteristics of individuals are exploited. And so I would say that encompasses most of it. And then legislatively, the two types are defined as sex and labor trafficking.
As she mentioned, federal law here in the United States set out two different forms, sex and labor, but both can be present in one situation at a single time. So a bit about my work. I am a staff attorney for the STARS program here in Detroit, where we help identify victims of trafficking in those two forms.
And then for a follow-up question, what are the current trends and patterns of human trafficking on a regional or a global scale?
I can start by speaking to what I've seen in my experience. So prior to coming to Detroit to start this STARS program, I worked for 5 years as an immigration attorney for victims in New York City. And so some of the most recent trends that I saw in that role had to do with the exploitation of recently arrived New Yorkers. So the newest of New Yorkers, those who you might have heard about being bused from the southern border and other southern states, are extremely vulnerable to both sex and labor trafficking upon their arrival, in New York City and elsewhere in the country, given their lack of work authorization, their need for basic things like housing and money and food. So those are one trend here regionally that I've seen, and I'll let Elizabeth talk more about maybe other trends or a more global perspective.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying about the characteristics that are exploited are so true. My research surrounds migrant vulnerability to human trafficking, but then does a comprehensive legislative analysis of the last decade. And so I can say that certainly human trafficking legislation is one of the anomalies in Congress where there is actually a lot of passing of legislation happening. However, there is like in terms of trends, that's one of them. But then also there has been a lot of uncertainties like amongst federal courts when it comes to human trafficking and just like prosecuting these traffickers and identifying them and locating them. And so I would say that while the trend of a lot of legislation is happening, there's also a trend of traffickers certainly getting away with a lot of the unclarity that's happening in our court systems as well.
All right. We also just have one more general question for the both of you. How have you guys seen societal and cultural norms shift over time in regard to the perception of human trafficking?
I can start. So I would say, honestly, human trafficking is one of those things, at least again, because my specialization is in legislation. And so it's one of those things that's almost become a buzzword in our society. There's no political stance that's pro human trafficking. Nobody is pro human trafficking, at least from a legislative point or when it's going through that process. However, I think while a lot of attention is given to it, there's a reason why I'm 22 years old and also the only person to have like done this decade analysis on the legislation. There seems to be also a lack of depth and understanding about this issue just amongst society as a whole. And so everybody's aware of it. But when it comes to asking more about like, what is it or how is it actually affecting our cities? Where is it? People just don't also seem to like know really a lot about the issue.
Yeah, totally. I think you're spot on that over time awareness has risen, but that doesn't necessarily mean understanding has. So the kind of I think the way that it's worked into our nation's like understanding or like the zeitgeist is that it's all sex trafficking. It could happen to anyone, anywhere, anytime. I've seen TikTok shared amongst other practitioners of like, there's a shoestring tied to my car door handle. Does that mean that I'm being targeted for trafficking? And the answer is most likely no. So there's this, while the understanding grows, I hope that in the future, people start understanding that, it's not just sex trafficking. There are different definitions and different qualifications for people who are being exploited for their labor, either by like legitimate businesses or more nefarious traffickers.
Thank you. Now this question is specific for Elizabeth. Since the Human Trafficking Prevention Act of 2022 required the National Human Trafficking Hotline number to be posted in numerous public places, what do you think is the next step for the government to help prevent human trafficking?
Yeah, and what a huge passage that was, and a great thing. I think so. Again, my population of study is migrant vulnerability to this issue, and so the main piece of legislation surrounding human trafficking was established in 2000, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And what it outlined is something called a T visa. A T visa is essentially a document for individuals who are undocumented or not citizens of this country, who enter in, are victims of trafficking, and in exchange for them partnering with law enforcement to help identify and locate traffickers and prosecute them, they can be granted up to 4 years of asylum in this country. I think that piece, like that was great foundationally. It has not really been expanded upon since 2000, and it has been nearly a quarter of a century since. And so every year in the Trafficking in Persons report, the United States Department of State recognizes migrant vulnerability to this issue. But the legislation and the depth of the one main piece of protection for migrants to this issue isn't being developed at all. And I think that is really the next step in terms of protections and providing guaranteed livability in this country in that asylum period.
So our next question, you kind of already mentioned it with the migrants, but through your research, have you witnessed a crossover between trafficked individuals and refugees?
Yes, most definitely. Short answer is yes, most definitely. I think I have a bit of a background in social work as well, and very small, just as a preference, but traffickers are abusers, so they locate certain individuals and they see certain characteristics and they exploit them. If you were to look at the biggest hotspots for trafficking in the United States, the chances are that the states of Texas, California, and New York would be flagged on your screen. More importantly, JFK Airport has actually also been noted as one of the biggest trafficking hotspots in the US. What do all 3 or 4 of these places have in common is that they're points of entry into this country. And I would say that traffickers, I mean, that's why there's also a Department of Justice special initiative just for the US-Mexico border for this trafficking crisis. Traffickers are seeing certain characteristics of individuals. They're seeing certain vulnerabilities of them, like not having legal knowledge, not having safety knowledge about the physical locations they're in, not speaking the first language. There's just so many characteristics of migrants that they're choosing to exploit. So yes, there's a huge crossover.
Now to you, Eli. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Everything you said was very, very helpful. But for Eli, what services do you offer for victims of human trafficking? And as a follow-up, what does the process of aftercare and reintegration look like for them?
Yeah, great question. So our office can represent foreign national victims of trafficking in immigration-related legal matters. We also provide them with case management services. By case management, I'm referring to coordinating the multiple forms of social support that a victim might need as they recover. This commonly includes medical care, mental health and substance abuse, treatments, as well as support in accessing different forms of public benefits like cash assistance. As an attorney, I chiefly prepare applications for T visas or U visas as well for victims and their families. I can also provide defense from removal. So if a person's ordered removed from the United States, we can try to stop that. And I can also advise clients as they report their trafficking to and cooperate with law enforcement. So those are some of the things that our office does. But all of our work is coming from this, you're right, like the reintegration aspect, where recovery can mean something slightly different for every survivor. But generally, I think that this process follows a pretty predictable path. A person must have their immediate needs met before they can begin like addressing the long-term consequences of their victimization and the trauma that brings about. So meeting these needs can be complicated when a victim lacks that immigration status, because it can take USCIS almost 2 years to approve or deny a application for status. And during that time, most victims lack work authorization and can be denied public benefits. So that's where case management comes in and tries to mitigate aspects of that situation.
And what are some common signs of exploitation that most people would be unaware of and should look out for?
So the two that came to mind for me that I'd want to draw your attention to are debts and threats of removal. If you're talking with someone and they're describing having to work somewhere for little or no pay in order to pay off a debt to their employer or someone associated with them, it is possible that they're experiencing debt bondage, which is a common form of labor trafficking. Likewise, if someone is telling you that their employer keeps bringing up their status and threatening to call ICE, their employer may be victimizing them as well. Under federal law, the TVPA, any threatened abuse of immigration or legal systems is a recognized form of coercion and might rise to an act of trafficking.
Wow. And lastly, what is the biggest challenge that you have faced and overcome as an attorney for human trafficking victims?
Yeah, so the one that came to mind was the challenge that attorneys like me face when we are helping victims secure what could be considered a long-term benefit in an immigration status, so the non-immigrant visa. So much can change for a client during that time while they're waiting. They might lose housing, they might run out of financial support, they might suffer from unaddressed medical needs. So as an attorney, I can't typically meet all of those needs. And the only way that I have managed to overcome these challenges with clients is to practice in a multidisciplinary setting where you can work with where my work is complemented by that of social workers, therapists, and other professionals. Another way that attorneys can overcome this is maintaining like a comprehensive network of organizations around the community that you know of and can refer clients to so that they can help meet those immediate needs. So that coordinated care aspect of the work is probably the hardest challenge to overcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. So now we're going to jump back to Elizabeth, but Eli, you're welcome to answer afterwards too if you have anything to add. So are human traffickers usually located and convicted?
No. So that has been the biggest, I mean, battle, I think not just in this country, but worldwide. I think the figure right now is somewhere around 47 or 44 million at one point are trafficked in this world at once right now. But that will never be accurate because this is an industry dependent on secrecy. And so we'll never truly know how many people are trafficked in this world. And we can do our best to try, but it's because it's dependent on secrecy, a lot of times victims aren't located and their traffickers aren't identified. And that's why there's initiatives with the T visa that in exchange for asylum, they need help with law enforcement. They need to work together because traffickers are going to know best how to locate and identify traffickers in this world. So, yeah.
Yeah, just adding to that, I would say here in the United States, perpetrators of sex trafficking are more likely to be apprehended and actually convicted of like trafficking crimes. We face a real challenge in reporting labor trafficking. Like there are, ostensibly the Department of Labor does investigate and charge people with trafficking related crimes. But very rarely do we see that translate into services and status and long-term support for those victims. It doesn't help that victims often lose status as part of their victimization if they are here in the United States on some sort of visa. So they are coming to this law enforcement cooperation as an undocumented person. And without many protections, and particularly without an attorney, that can be a real barrier for them actually cooperating in the prosecution because they fear, the consequences of being here without status. And yeah, sorry, I'll end there.
And then, as a final question for Elizabeth, what have you discovered in your research that the U.S. is lacking or is concerned with human trafficking prevention?
Yeah. Well, I would say a lot of legislation has, again, it's one of those anomalies in Congress where a lot of legislation actually has been passed, which is great. But I would say one thing that I think has been really awesome has been like they've established a task for combating human trafficking, or there's within each state's attorney general, there's also a task for combating human trafficking. And so that's one recognition that I think has been established statewide, because every state in this country does deal with human trafficking in some way, shape, or form. And so that's one way that I've definitely seen each state get their kind of like own spotlight to handle their own like particular facets with trafficking that's going on within its borders. I would also say that there has also been just a lot of there's been a lot of partnerships with a lot of like big nonprofits as well from the federal government as well. They're also making huge efforts to report it as much as they can, which is why the Trafficking in Persons report, which is published by the Department of State, is published every year. So there have been a lot that has happened and given for trafficking prevention in this country.
Thank you.
And then jumping back to Eli, why and how did the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants develop the STARS program in Detroit?
Yeah, so USCRI has long served refugee and immigrant communities in Michigan. So they have a longstanding office in Dearborn, and I believe they may be across the state as well. Further, USCRI also administers one of the federal programs intended to assist trafficking victims called TVAP, the Trafficking Victim Assistance Program. And that directly supports victims of trafficking in their recovery. In its work, USCRI found that there was a lack of trafficking-specific legal services in the Detroit area, although there are some great social service organizations doing excellent work here. So we started the program earlier this year, while the city looks to better coordinate their response to trafficking through a task force of law enforcement agencies, city officials, and relevant nonprofit organizations. So it's our hope that STARS might represent the legal and social needs of survivors in that venue. So we see it as an extension of the work that's going on in the city.
And then, looking back on your past as an attorney for trafficking victims, could you share a success story that is representative of your organization's work?
Sure. This story is from my previous but nearly identical position in NYC, as we're just getting underway in Detroit. So our office represented a person trafficked in the United States by their extended family. Here, they were subjected to labor trafficking at that family's home. We helped this mother get approved for the T visa as a trafficking survivor. Unfortunately, this mother had been separated from one of her children, who had been made to remain abroad in their home country. Due to concerns about the child's safety, our client had entrusted them to a friend who kept the child's location secret from the extended the family who had victimized them. So we got the child approved for a derivative visa so that they could rejoin their mother here in the United States. However, we still needed to get this child out of the home country while maintaining that safety that was brought about by the secrecy. So we achieved this with the help of the International Organization for Migration, who helped us navigate the hurdles in country. So they supported us in that regard. So it was a really special experience getting to accompany my client to JFK to reunite with their child. They'd not seen each other for nearly a decade, and seeing them unify with one another and begin a life together here was very rewarding. And I'm happy to say that they expect to receive their green card soon.
Thank you.
And then for our finishing question for the both of you, we have, how can individuals get involved with anti-human trafficking initiatives?
I
You
ahead.
go for it.
All right. I'd ask folks to become more familiar with signs of labor exploitation and trafficking. If you see or hear about situations that you think a person might be being victimized, I encourage you to bring that situation to the attention of local anti-trafficking organizations or like legal aid offices, the Department of Labor. So those organizations are preferable to just like contacting law enforcement, because that poses, you don't know what law enforcement agency may actually respond. So giving that information over to a nonprofit or law office can help ensure that the right law enforcement agency responds and gathers the right information before taking any action that might jeopardize a victim. This can even happen on student visas. So this is something that you should consider, if you're like in your studies, like it happens everywhere.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that here, like this conversation that's being had right now is huge, just in general. I think especially with you guys as students more tangibly, this is something where again, there's a lot of like breadth, it's a buzzword, but there's not a lot of depth. And so I think the more initiatives that like we can have on campuses, I think for students such as yourselves, like you guys have a lot that you could be like making students aware of with this issue. And so I just like want to take a second to celebrate that this conversation is happening, 'cause that's a huge step just like towards a lot of the action we can be taking. Also, so again, with the trafficking task force that's established in each state, a lot of times there's training on how to host conversations. Michigan, I know, certainly does this. You can get involved and like get trained to be a trainer, to like integrate more of these conversations. I think that is just a huge step. And as a student myself, I think getting this conversation on campuses can really inform like the next generation of lawyers, social workers, policy leaders. Yeah, I think that's what I'd recommend.
Yeah, thank you guys very much for talking to us today. Very insightful.